Welcome, everyone. I'm Kerry King, Assistant Director and Research Scientist at the Energy Institute of the University of Texas. Before I introduce our guest, our own Dr. David Spence today, I will remind everyone of the rest of the schedule for this semester. So next week will be, again, our own Alex Hansen here from the University of Texas at Austin. Will be a discussion about power converters, so electronics and power conversion at the small and efficient scale, and why he focuses on this. Our last two talks of the semester will be a little bit more in line with what we have today in the areas of energy policy and climate and energy policy. So we'll have Noah Kaufman, who's a University of Texas graduate, speaking on what I guess is now a new administration we expect upcoming from when he wrote his title. And then we'll have Lizzie Fletcher, Representative Lizzie Fletcher, for the final talk of the semester. She won her district again, so she's won re-election, and she will talk about thoughts about her congressional priorities for energy policy. But today, November 10th, we have our own Dr. David Spence, who's the Baker-Botts Chair in Law and professor at the University of Texas School of Law. He's also a professor, has appointments in the business school as well. His title of his talk today is Climate, Complexity, and the Politics of Major Regulatory Legislation. This is an area, of course, of his specialty. So he's going to talk about transitioning to net zero carbon emissions by next century and how this requires a policy push and how we can think about the challenges of this political task. Just a little bit more background on Dr. Spence. As well as being a professor in School of Law. Again, he's a professor in Business, Government, and Society Department of the McCombs School of Business. His teaching and research concerns regulatory law and politics, particularly the regulation of the energy industry. So he's one of our experts in that area. He is also one of the founders of the website energytradeoffs.com, which features research addressing the difficult trade-offs and value choices associated with the green energy transition. And part of that website is a series of podcasts that are quite informative and speaking to different people thinking about the policy and law questions regarding transition to renewables or low carbon. So I will now hand it over to Dr. Spence. And as I do that, I will state that we will take questions as usual through the Q&A or the question and answer section of the Zoom webinar. But we will also try this time to allow you to ask a question verbally. So if you want to ask a question verbally, use the raise your hand feature in the participant window, and I will select you at the end of his talk to allow you to ask your question and try to keep them within 30 seconds or so. So we have time for multiple questions. And again, we're going to take all questions at the end so we can get through his talk, and he will stay around as needed to answer those questions. So with that introduction done on how we'll handle Q&A, I will actually hand it over to Dr. Spence and let him begin. Dave, it's all yours.
Thanks a lot, Kerry, and thanks to Andrew and Alexis and the Energy Institute for organizing this talk today. I'm happy to be able to do this. As the title suggests, this talk is about the political challenges associated with an energy transition, say to net zero emissions by middle of this century or sooner. This is a post-election version of a talk that I've been giving earlier this semester around at other universities. It's a very broad topic. It covers a lot of ground, so I'm going to move right through it in I promise, 40 minutes or less. And we can unpack any parts of it that you like during the question and answer period. I should say at the outset that I based this talk on two assumptions. One, of course, is that climate change is a real problem, human-driven, and an urgent problem in the sense that the benefits of acting now to mitigate it strongly exceed the costs of doing so. And so that transitioning to a net zero carbon emission economy is a good idea. That's one assumption. The second assumption is that the transition is going to require national legislation. That particular type of transition, that is getting to net zero, it's going to require national legislation. And while there are plenty of things that presidents and states and companies can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, for a variety of reasons, I think that getting to net zero, we can't get to net zero with just those kinds of actions. We're going to need Congress to be part of the solution. So those are the two operating premises here. If you disagree with either of those, this talk may not resonate with you as much. Nevertheless, I'd be happy to talk about those as well during the question and answer period. My central argument here, and these pictures come from our website, energytradeoffs.com, but my central point here is that because of the complexity and the magnitude of this task, it can only be achieved if we are willing now to face and discuss the difficult trade-offs, the distributional choices we're going to have to make in order to get there. And the secondary point here is that there are unique or unprecedented features of the political landscape right now that push us away from that kind of conversation, all of which makes the task more difficult and the prospects for success less likely or less favorable. So we use this quote from the movie version of Lincoln on our website to make this point. In the movie, you may recall that the radical Republicans chastise Lincoln a little bit and accuse him of lacking a moral compass because he is initially cautious about seeking Congress's approval of the 13th Amendment. Lincoln responds with the quote you see in the box here. And he says that a compass will point you in the right direction, but you still need to understand the obstacles in your way if you're going to reach your destination. He calls them the swamps and the chasms and the deserts that might be in your way. So this talk is not about a particular policy or pushing a particular policy, but rather about fostering a political environment that's more conducive to understanding those obstacles, those kinds of obstacles, and therefore ultimately to finding solutions by way of legislation. It's about getting to national climate legislation. And I delivered this talk in three basic parts. The last part, it's only the last part of the talk where I get to discussions of Congress. The first two parts are really about these under-discussed trade-offs and why we tend to miss them. So I think probably everyone knows that there have always been tensions between ensuring a reliable supply of energy, making it affordable, and making it clean. And technological change has made some of these trade-offs easier, particularly of late, and particularly in the electricity sector, but it hasn't eliminated them entirely. And it's probably safe to assume that for politicians, maintaining a reliable supply of energy is probably a non-negotiable part of this, this triangle here. So getting to net zero across the economy, particularly in a time of historic levels of economic inequality in our society, means that we ought to pay attention to cost, both for political and strategic reasons, but also for ethical reasons. Which is not to say that there are no win-win opportunities out there for consumers. There are, especially in the electricity industry. We've long understood that there are energy efficiency investments and changes in consumption patterns that would save money and reduce energy use and reduce carbon emissions. And particularly on the generation side in the electricity sector, it's a particularly propitious time to decarbonize, and because utility scale wind and solar generation are now the cheapest forms of electricity that we have on a levelized cost basis, meaning that if these kinds of plants can sell all of their output, they can recover their costs at lower power prices than other competing technologies can. That's the data you see in the upper right-hand part of this slide. And as you can see in the rest of the slide, there's lots of room in the generation market for these sources to grow. In most of the country, we could be replacing more expensive, dirtier forms of generation with cleaner, cheaper renewables. And grid managers have found that they can integrate a lot more wind and solar power than they ever thought possible while keeping the lights on. So that's all good news. But it doesn't imply that a zero emission grid is another simple win-win proposition. As we get to very high levels of renewables on the system, the trade-offs start to get a lot more dicey. If we focus on the kind of out-of-pocket costs that consumers and politicians care about, remember we're focusing on getting legislation passed here. So if we're focusing on those out-of-pocket costs, a net zero grid is probably a more expensive grid than the one we have now, at least for the time being, until technology gets better and cheaper. And certainly an all renewables grid is going to be a more expensive option than a net zero emission, carbon emission grid that's technology neutral. A lot of smart people have published models and grid designs that show that an all renewables grid is possible, or that a no nuclear, no fossil fuel grid is technically possible, and it is. But because wind and solar generation is intermittent, and because we need to build excess generators to cover for and store energy for the times when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, these systems have to be a lot bigger than the system we have now. And we have to build all the transmission lines that will connect all of that new infrastructure together. A lot of this infrastructure will be rarely needed, so its levelized costs are going to be a lot higher. They're going to be different than we saw on that previous slide. And we have conversations on the Tradeoffs website with modelers who estimate the out-of-pocket costs associated with different grid configurations, different net zero carbon emission grid configurations, and of course, systems that include so-called firm low carbon resources like nuclear or natural gas with carbon capture or renewable methane, et cetera. Those are cheaper systems than the ones that limit the technology options only to renewables. Now, it's worth remembering that we don't build our infrastructure in this country by way of grand top-down designs like we see in these models. We build what the private sector investors are willing to build, and we use policy to try and steer that investment, which raises the question, can we count on investors to build what the models suggest is optimal in the locations that the models suggest? Maybe, maybe not. Might investors be wary of building and owning and maintaining infrastructure that will be very rarely used? Maybe. A lot of the interesting policy questions in the policy literature address those sorts of questions. But even if investors want to build all the right infrastructure and they want to put it in the right places, not in my backyard resistance makes that sometimes difficult. You may know that New England and New York are struggling right now to say yes to major transmission infrastructure that would bring hydroelectric power down from Quebec. Both areas of the country are also struggling to site offshore wind. So they have aggressive decarbonization goals, but they're having trouble building the infrastructure they need to meet them. And just as the costs of climate change tend to fall disproportionately on poorer communities, so do the costs of siting and hosting new energy infrastructure tend to fall on poorer neighborhoods, all else equal. And so what all this suggests, I think, or the more general point, I guess, is that when you restrict the technologies that you allow to be part of the solution that can provide net zero emission energy, you increase the cost of the system. And even in the face of a climate emergency, costs are going to matter. They're going to matter to those people who have fewer dollars, and they're certainly going to matter to politicians. This is a truism across all of the sectors of the economy that we would have to transform in order to get to a net zero emission economy. Smart people at UT and at lots of other universities are working on all sorts of innovative low emissions solutions for transport, manufacturing, buildings, agriculture. Hopefully policy choices that we make going forward will not undermine or restrict the kinds of solutions that they might devise. Unfortunately, in carbon debates these days, we see a lot of boosterism for particular technologies. If you're on social media, there is sort of a team nuclear and a team anti-nuclear and a team renewables. There's even a team anti-renewables. It's a small team, but it's out there. And debate, of course, is healthy, but we can't become such technology partisans that we oppose progress that doesn't follow our particular team's prescription. There's lots of possible technologies that can be part of a net zero emission future. And here's the thing, we're terrible at predicting what technologies will be effective and affordable and available and scalable in the future. I've been in this field a long time. I certainly didn't predict the fracking revolution. I didn't predict the speed at which solar power would get cheaper. So might there be cheap nuclear in the future, or cheap carbon capture and storage, or some other form of rapidly scalable cheap storage? I don't know, and neither does anybody else really. So this implies that we ought to keep our eyes on the prize here, which is emissions, limiting emissions, rather than specifying particular technologies. There are also policy instrument partisans out there in these debates. Less so, but particularly on the subject of carbon taxes, there's a lot of ossification of positions. People are firmly pro-carbon tax or firmly anti-carbon tax, or at least increasingly they are. Fortunately, in a couple of weeks, you're going to hear, a few weeks, you're going to hear from Noah Kaufman, who is not that way. He'll give you a very nuanced discussion of carbon taxes. But both within academia and the wider policy community, we are seeing some more rigidity there. And it's fine to have preferences over policy instruments, nothing wrong with that. But what if legislators can only cobble together a majority in support of a different regulatory approach than the one you want, but one that is nevertheless effective at reducing emissions and does so in an equitable, relatively affordable way? Are you going to oppose that? There are policy instrument advocates out there who sound like they might become an enemy of the good in the pursuit of their particular vision of perfection. That would be a shame, I think, at least from my point of view. Sometimes I hear people respond to a discussion of trade-offs with skepticism, and they say something like, wait a minute, we're in a climate crisis here, and you're talking about the downsides and the costs and the trade-offs. That plays right into the hands of opponents, and there's no time for that. You're like the soldier charging up Omaha Beach on D-Day, asking his sergeant if he is sure that this is the right beach. That's not helpful. What we need now is more inspiration, not doubt. I hear that sometimes when I raise these issues, but I don't agree with that. I think the thing is we're not charging up the beach. We are planning right now. We're discussing what climate policy ought to look like or could look like at the same time that we're trying to make it happen. Yes, those two things are in tension with one another, but we can manage that tension, and we need to. We need to do both. The quote at the top of this slide is from the father of the current governor of New York, who himself was governor a while back. And it's intended, or it's one way of saying that we need to do both. Leaders need to inspire and be ruthlessly analytical about identifying the obstacles in their path so that we can understand them and know how to address them. And also, if I inspire you by misleading you, I only earn a temporary victory at the cost of your trust. And right now, climate progress is going to require building bridges to broaden support. I want to sort of get to the second part of my talk here, which is that the problem is that the political conditions today make doing these things, having the kind of conversations I just described, difficult. And the picture equation you see at the bottom of this slide is one way of expressing what the point I'm trying to make in this second part of the talk here. We have forces distorting our perception of the issues and of each other, making it harder to engage across ideological and other boundaries, and most importantly, harder to think critically about the things that we want. And that's an important predicate to finding policy agreement. This is the post-truth world that you've heard so much about. And I have no doubt that you see it in others, this dynamic. It's a lot harder to see it in ourselves, which is not to suggest that this phenomenon is symmetrical across party lines and ideological lines, but neither is it absent from any part of the political spectrum. It's everywhere. And so we need to fight to keep it out of the process of building a climate majority. The quote in the box at the lower left is from Federalist number 10. It illustrates part of the equation, that picture equation from the previous slide. And it also illustrates that this idea is not new. Political philosophers have always understood that what we want influences what we believe. It's how human brains are wired. And so politicians and lobbyists have always tried to capitalize on that wiring to shape what we see in our mind's eye when we think about political issues or actors, and to induce positive feelings about some issues and actors and negative feelings about others. And they know that if they can do that, a fascinating set of cognitive biases will kick in, making their jobs a lot easier. They won't have to work as hard to get us to focus on the facts that help their cause and to ignore the ones that don't. Our brains will do it for them. And in the last half century, behavioral psychology and cultural anthropology and a number of other social sciences have really fleshed out a lot of these biases in an interesting way. The books you see here are sort of popular descriptions of some of those. Many of you are familiar with this literature, no doubt, and I'm not going to elaborate on the few biases listed here on the lower right, except to say that they're worth understanding if you're interested in climate policy, because they play a big role in how our democracy is fracturing right now and how we at times unconsciously accelerate that process. One of the things that is new in that picture equation I showed you is how political polarization is supercharging those biases. This figure uses data, widely used data, that places members of Congress on an ideological spectrum from left to right. So this is congressional ideology. This particular figure is showing the ideological distance between the two parties in Congress over time, so that as the figure moves higher along the y-axis, the distance between the parties is greater. And you have one line for the House and one for Senate. And you can see that the parties are as far apart as they've really ever been since before the Civil War. And when the parties are bitterly divided like they are now, each party comes to regard the other's agenda as alarming, even disastrous, which injects a lot more emotion into the political debate. We want what we want much more intensely, which influences the way we reason through political challenges like forging a climate policy. So we see this sense of extreme urgency contributing to the ongoing breakdown of fairness norms in political and policy competition right now, including some of the conspiratorial fantasticism with which the president and his allies are greeting the election outcome. If emotion tends to amplify our biases, polarization amplifies emotions. And modern media supercharges both of them. So let me spend a little time talking about that. And for most of the 20th century, modern mass media was a unifying force. It was bland and slow and corporate and white and male, but it also exhibited that characteristic of centralizing understanding, creating a common understanding. There were only a few national news outlets populated by journalists who were at least trained to aspire to objectivity and to double check and triple check sources before publishing stories. The news was heavily curated and parsed out to us rarely, daily or weekly, like carefully brewed tea. We had time to savor the tea, to sip it, to read each story to the end, or to listen to each story to the end of it. Now we get our information online, and it comes at us much differently, faster and in higher volumes. It comes at us even when we aren't looking for it. And much of that information is not curated, not aiming to inform so much as persuade. And it comes from advocates who are not necessarily interested in giving us a complete sort of warts and all picture of an issue or a problem or a policy solution, because persuasion is their goal. And separating the good information from the propaganda is more difficult now than it's ever been. There is so much of it that we don't really feel we have time to digest it fully and slowly. If we read to the 20th paragraph, that's gonna take time away from seeing the sort of headline of another story. So we don't read to the 20th paragraph, or even the second paragraph sometimes. And that's a big problem, because deep understanding of policy issues means grappling with the complexities and the qualifications and all the caveats, all the context that you only get when you read to the 20th paragraph. Even if you go searching for reputable sources online and read to the 20th paragraph, the information you see online is still going to be censored for reasons that you all understand. We tend to click on stories that support our prior beliefs. And once we do that, social media algorithms learn what we like and give us more of it. They learn what we don't like and give us less of it. So all these forces, our cognitive biases, the ramped up emotion associated with polarization, and the fragmented media landscape, they all conspire to hide from us the messy downsides and complexity of the things that we want, the things that we hope we can do. We lose the habit of looking for that complexity. We lose the critical thinking muscles. They begin to atrophy. And particularly with respect, that's true particularly with respect to the things that we want. And let's not overlook the social process of digesting information, which is really crucial to how we form beliefs. That used to be done by talking to neighbors and family and coworkers friends about the news. And that had a lot of sort of context and nuance that comes with face-to-face communication. If we do this mostly online now, we lose that context and that nuance. Online groups tend to be more ideologically homogenous. That's what the book, The Filter Bubble, is all about. If we're processing the news in these ideologically homogenous filter bubbles, we tend to form beliefs a lot faster, and they firm up a lot faster. And so a kind of orthodoxy arises within the bubble. We even experience sort of chasing away, maybe not intentionally, but effectively chasing away dissent. And we exit groups that we feel like we don't fit in well. So anonymity makes all of that easier. And a growing body of literature supports the notion that both false information, lies, and emotionally charged information gets spread farther and faster online. In the bluntest terms, we see a lot of false information, a lot of half-truths that encourage us to hate something or someone. Online conversations are also less honest than real-life conversations for another reason. In fact, it's the same reason that reality TV is less honest than real life. The presence of a potential audience online makes us conscious of the fact that what we say is being evaluated by other people we don't know. And the conversation is therefore no longer about just exchanging views and learning from one another. Now it becomes about persuasion, or at least partly sometimes. We all become lobbyists in a sense, almost reflexively, emphasizing the dimensions of the problem that we think will persuade others to our point of view and de-emphasizing the other aspects of the problem. And when that happens, we stop learning from one another. We can be educators and advocates, but not at the same time. So you can see how all this becomes a vicious cycle. If you've seen the Netflix documentary mentioned at the bottom of the slide here, The Social Dilemma, you know how powerful and how insidious this all can be. So what do we do about it? We have to be conscious of the pictures we're forming in our mind's eye. We have to audit them. We have to ask ourselves, am I so emotionally attached to my beliefs that it's stopping me from engaging in debates on the merits of my point of view, my beliefs, and others' points of view? Am I trying to win conversations rather than learn from them? Am I letting my sense of contempt, am I letting contempt narratives prevent those conversations in the first place? Are there actors in the climate debate that I've written off and that might nevertheless have something to contribute to an affordable, reliable, zero emission energy supply of the future? Have I been persuaded to sort of rule out potential solutions that might be really helpful in the future? We have to ask ourselves all of those questions in this environment to try and avoid the powerful forces, or at least mitigate the effects of these powerful forces that are working on us, working against us. Which brings me to part three. This is the Congress part of the talk. What does all this mean for the congressional politics of climate legislation? This person you see pictured here is Ted Halstead, who recently died at a young age, unfortunately. He gave a very famous TED Talk, well, famous by policy wonk standards, on climate bipartisanship. In fact, the tagline of the talk was, "The path to climate progress runs through the Republican Party." I don't know if that's true or not, but that path certainly leads through the ideological center of Congress, of both the House and the Senate. And that's what we have to keep in mind as we think about the legislative politics of climate change. People in every filter bubble are represented in Congress, some more than others, frankly. So engagement across filter bubble lines, across ideological lines and other lines, is necessary if we're going to build legislative majorities. Historically speaking, Congress's willingness to pass major regulatory legislation, the kind that rearranges the costs and benefits of economic activity in a big way, like climate legislation certainly would, that willingness has been mostly confined to a very few short periods in our history when the conditions for that kind of action were just right. Most of the regulatory state that we have now, at least at the federal level, was created during three periods that you see here, which collectively comprise about 1/5 of Congress's history. So major regulatory legislation is not a frequent thing, but as you can see by the number of statutes on this slide, it does happen. And it happens usually when there is a public outcry for regulation that becomes strong enough that Congress has to respond. And policy scholars over the decades from a variety of disciplines have coined a variety of different terms for these situations. I'm going to show you them now, or some of them now. These are all different labels used for the idea that sometimes issues become much more salient to the public in an urgent way. And so I'm not going to define each of these terms. They all roughly get at that same idea in different ways. But when you look back at these periods of regulatory productivity that are in these three columns here, what you find is that the public outcry is there, but it's not enough by itself. You have to have a receptive, partisan ideological environment in Congress as well for legislation to happen, such that almost all of the bills you see here were passed by much more than bare majority support. And when you look more closely at how they passed, you see that this tends to happen under either of two circumstances. One is when there is a majority party in both houses of Congress that has such large margins of dominance that it can essentially impose its will on the other party. The New Deal, the 6 short years of the New Deal, which is the middle column here, is the most stark illustration of this. The smallest margins that Democrats had in the House and Senate during the New Deal were 126 seats in the House and 23 seats in the Senate, meaning that there were 126 more Democrats, 23 more Democrats than there were Republicans in those two chambers, respectively. Overwhelming dominance. And we're not likely, I think, to see that kind of dominance anytime soon today because of structural advantages that conservatives and Republicans have in the Senate, where rural voters tend to be overrepresented by numbers, and rural voters tend to be conservative and Republican. So we're not going to see that kind of dominance in either or both chambers, I think, anytime soon. So the other situation historically where we tend to see this kind of major regulatory legislation passed is when we have a kind of temporary bipartisanship that arises around an issue. Usually because the issue is new and segments of each of the parties try to be identified with it so as to capture the votes of the people that care about the issue. The most obvious example of this is the progressive era, when you had prominent leaders in the Republican Party like Teddy Roosevelt and prominent leaders in the Democratic Party like Woodrow Wilson, who both wanted to be identified as progressives. The Republican Party ultimately lost the fight to be identified with progressivism, and Democrats captured that issue. Same thing happened in the 1970s, early 70s, it's actually starting in the late 60s, when Republicans and Democrats both competed to be identified with environmentalism as an issue. Richard Nixon signed the order that created the EPA, signed the National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and a lot of other environmental statutes. And even as late as 1990, George Herbert Walker Bush signed major amendments to the Clean Air Act. And it wasn't until the very end of the 20th century that the Republicans ultimately ceded that issue to Democrats and sort of turned away from environmentalism for good, once and for all. And if you look back at the 70s, when that kind of issue competition was present, you also see that Congress was a much more conducive place to bipartisanship. This is information that comes from that same data set I referenced earlier, placing members of Congress on a left to right ideological scale measured from -1 to +1 in the way that it's done in the measurement. You can see that the parties back then were heterogeneous ideologically. There was overlap between them ideologically. The most conservative Democrat was ideologically to the right of the most liberal Republican. And if you compare that to the way Congress looks today, it's not true anymore. The parties are much more homogenous ideologically. There's no ideological overlap between them, and the median members of each party have moved farther apart from one another. In particular, the GOP since the 70s has moved pretty sharply to the right by this measure. Unfortunately, part of that change involves the Republican Party, opposing climate policy in a pretty firm way across the board, at least right now. It's almost a pillar of party doctrine to oppose it. After the election the other day, Mitt Romney, considered a moderate within the party, articulated a strong anti-climate policy message in his post-election remarks. And Republicans who have reached out on climate policy have jeopardized their electoral futures. I mean, some of the most prominent ones have lost primary challenges in part because of that. All of which makes Ted Halstead's dream of bipartisan climate policy seem like a pretty tall order. And for people that would like to see climate legislation, it's pretty depressing. So the question is, what can you do about it? Well, you can face this reality and get to work on two different fronts. One is sort of a near-term game plan, and the other is more of a long game. One is creating a future Congress that's more receptive to climate policy, and the other is trying to pass what we can now. So the near-term objective, I think the near-term thing that people who want to see climate legislation can do is regardless of what face the fact that regardless of what most voters want, and there's a lot of support for climate policy across party lines in the younger generations, regardless of what voters want, we have to face the fact that meaningful climate legislation is a non-starter in a Senate in which Mitch McConnell is the majority leader. 2/3 of the seats that will be contested in 2022 are Republican seats. And if the Senate can flip to Democratic control either then, or if it can flip sooner with these outstanding races, that improves the chances of having meaningful climate legislation sooner rather than later. But over the long haul, I would argue that we ought not to give up on a version of Ted Halstead's vision. I think we can still hold out hope that climate policy will become a bipartisan issue, at least for some Republicans, because climate impacts will continue to worsen, and Republicans in climate impacted areas may begin to change their tune. And there's lots of climate impacts that people are recognizing that are severe and important and costly right now. You all probably know that in Miami, there is sort of daily street flooding caused by sea level rise, and king tides in the Florida Keys and elsewhere are much worse than they used to be. No less of a sort of Trump supporter than Matt Gaetz, House Representative Matt Gaetz, wrote that climate change is an urgent problem that we have to address now. The other day, he published a book saying that. There's land loss happening in red states. North Carolina's Outer Banks are being severely impacted. Louisiana is losing a lot of coastline, and elected officials there of both parties are starting to recognize that. In Delaware and Maryland, saltwater intrusion into what is one of the richest farming areas in the country is starting to destroy farms. Coastal plains are losing land. The drought is exacerbating western wildfires. All of these things have important economic consequences that will only get more severe. In today's trade news that came to my inbox on email was this piece about the Federal Reserve warning of a climate sort of economic crisis. All of these effects mean that it'll be more difficult to get insurance and mortgages on increasing amounts of property all across the country, and therefore it'll be harder to sell property. Taxpayer-funded crop insurance, taxpayer-funded flood insurance will become a more expensive proposition. And presumably, elected representatives in Congress will start to see the irrationality of imposing more of those costs on taxpayers to protect the land that's being affected by climate change. So that kind of hope for that kind of a change of heart by individual members of the Republican Party in Congress, I think is not an unreasonable hope. Some on the progressive left are optimistic about the ability to bring change in Congress faster by crafting a climate or articulating a climate policy that would focus on sort of big, bold action that would distribute a lot of tangible economic benefits, say, millions of jobs. widely enough to voters to create kind of a rapid realignment of voters toward progressivism. I hear those arguments a lot. They see ideology and party loyalty as relatively weak drivers of support for Republicans among voters for a variety of reasons having to do with the nature of modern Republican partisanship and loyalty to the party, and frankly, to the nature of the jobs that are on offer in a rapid transition compared to the jobs that are being lost. I don't share that optimism, but regardless, even if Democrats were to take control of the Senate in 2020 or 2022, the support of all Democrats for a big, bold, ambitious climate bill is not at all automatic or assured. Climate legislation in the next Congress will require the support of Democrats like the ones you see here, who are, by another measure, this is a progressive score that comes from a progressive group. By their measure, these are the most conservative Democrats in Congress. They represent purple states, purple jurisdictions or red jurisdictions. They face electoral pressures from relatively conservative constituents. And if those members react to a big, bold climate bill by expressing concerns about trade-offs or costs or how the legislation will affect some of the industries in their jurisdictions, you may hear people in your online bubble or your community dismiss them as, corrupt or in the pocket of industry or insufficiently brave or bold, but they're only doing what members of Congress do. They're trying to protect their reelection prospects by looking out for the concerns expressed by their constituents. Members of Congress actually do that. And so all legislation, including legislation, frankly, that would try to circumvent these problems by adding states to the union or constitutional amendments or even adding judgeships, all that legislation requires the support of the median voter in each chamber of Congress. And these people are what the median voter in Congress is likely to look like, even if Democrats take control. So let me, as I'm nearing the 40-minute mark, let me bookend this presentation with another movie quote. This one comes from Apollo 13. I don't know how many of you have seen that movie, but you're probably familiar with the crisis, the real world crisis. In the movie Apollo 13, people on the ground, including astronaut Ken Mattingly, are working in a simulator to try to figure out how the Apollo 13 crew up in the spacecraft can restart all the onboard computer systems that they need to be able to re-enter the Earth's orbit. And they have to figure out how to do that with very little power left on the disabled ship. And they fail, as you remember, if you've seen the movie, they fail over and over in the simulator trying to get these systems up and started within the power limits they have. And Mattingly eventually just snaps at the young engineer on the right of this picture, saying something like, we can't do this. We need all these systems. How are we going to do this without all these systems? And then the engineer responds with the quote that you see here. Ken, you're telling me what you need. I'm telling you what we have to work with at this point. I'm not making this stuff up. And that's where we are right now with climate policy. We're facing difficult political, technological, and economic realities. That's just the way the world is right now. And maintaining one's sense of ambition and willingness to persist anyway is crucial, as is facing these trade-offs. That's kind of the mental tightrope that we're walking right now. And a lot of people and a lot of forces, the forces I've described here, are either consciously or unconsciously trying to push us off of that tightrope from both directions. And so it's not an easy or comfortable task ahead. To the contrary, it's uncomfortable, but it's the only realistic option we have. And with that, I'm just going to close with a couple of more quotes, two more of the sort of 40 or so quotes we have on the site that try to get at some of these ideas. And I will thank everybody for their time and be willing to take questions.
Thank you very much, David. I thought it was quite insightful and provoking here. So again, please go ahead and ask some questions within the Q&A feature, or raise your hand in the panelist window, and we'll select you to ask a question. So I'll start off here. From your, I thought the historical, or the look at when major regulatory legislation occurred and the conditions at which it occurred was a nice summary and pretty insightful. And of course, we have some maybe some insights here from the COVID epidemic that my question is, can we apply what you know then and what we've seen from the COVID epidemic to the concept of doing something like climate legislation from the standpoint of what me as an engineer might call time delays. I act on something now, and then I only get to see the result from it later. So in COVID, it's like act now, and you kind of actually get to see results pretty soon, like 2, 3, 4 weeks in terms of the length of time people are infectious. I guess in terms of environmental legislation, maybe some things were no time delay, like there were dirty rivers and people knew that I want these cleaned up right now. Climate has this really long time delay. So are there any insights you can get into why this problem is the same or different, or what we've learned?
Yeah, this is sort of a crucial problem with the politics of dealing with climate, and that is that you incur the costs of mitigating these effects now, and that benefits are spread into the distant future with essentially be realized by future generations. We won't, some of the significant number of them we won't see ourselves, some we will, but so that's a sort of continuous problem with climate politics. The other problem is that they're worldwide benefits, the spread worldwide. You can spend money to reduce emissions in the United States, and the benefits of that will be felt in the United States, but a lot of them will be felt elsewhere as well. And you need international cooperation along those lines to sort of really, really make the kind of worldwide impact that you need to make. On the other hand, the United States is responsible for the lion's share, or a big share anyway, of the historical emissions. And so you can make an ethical argument that it owes a duty to go first, to go early, to be one of the, but not first. Europe's already doing something, so go second. And you can also make the argument that by forcing action in the OECD countries now, you're promoting the kind of technological innovation and cost reductions that might make it easier for other countries to be part of the solution as well. Let me just say one more thing about sort of time trajectory, which is, I'm not sure if this is part of what you were asking, but in the New Deal, for example, the Congress that I showed you with the overwhelming margins wasn't created all in one election. It was a series of elections over time that built these huge majorities. The Depression was obviously a big precipitating factor, and Hoover's inability to deal with it to the satisfaction of the public was a big part of it. And maybe the pandemic will prove to be something similar, although the last election didn't seem to point in that direction. A lot of Republicans did pretty well in down ballot races.
Right. If our scientists are really great at making new vaccines and it's less than an electoral cycle, then maybe it doesn't last long enough to have a political push. Okay, questions from the Q&A here. It's a question on essentially the idea of wage inequality, economic inequality, and the cost of a transition. So question here is, explain more about the relationship between economic inequality and energy and transition. Is this just an issue of cost of energy, or how do we think about other factors? Let me add one thing in terms of what, let's just say, policymakers or, I don't know, we the citizens influencing them, and then what they're actually in control of. Are we more in control of distribution? Let's just say distribution of money and income versus knowing the ultimate size of the economy or the ultimate cost of an energy transition. And, how can we think about that in terms of these trade-offs? So we say, well, I don't know what the costs are, but I'm going to try to make things more equal and whole on that side, so to reduce those impacts. So.
Yeah, so I'll try to remember. If I forget any part of your question, remind me. But the initial question was to sort of say a little bit more about the cost of a transition, and I only briefly touched on the sort of price of energy side of it. Those models I was talking about were really about the price of energy. Obviously, there are also sort of economy-wide costs associated with shifting from one industry to another, and so there's job losses in fossil fuel industry. There would be job losses, although again, I don't assume necessarily that fossil fuels will be absent from the system. They'll still be a much smaller part. So you'd have job losses in the fossil fuel industry, job losses in sort of traditional power plants. And what I obliquely referred to earlier was the notion that a lot of these jobs that are being lost are sort of permanent jobs in one place, usually union jobs. not so much in the oil and gas industry, but in the coal industry, and then again in the power plants. These are in traditional big power plants. Those are, permanent union jobs. And so the jobs on offer for green transition are huge in number, and they're good jobs in the sense that they're construction jobs, but they're sort of move around temporary jobs, right? And people who are being displaced don't find it satisfying or satisfactory for you to tell them, but we're creating all these other new jobs that are elsewhere, away from your town, right? So that's part of the political dislocation issue or political opposition issue, that another set of costs associated with all this. I did reference the sort of NIMBY type cost, the cost of having a new infrastructure put into your community. To your point about what we can control, first of all, I think your book is something everybody ought to look at in terms of taking a big macro, a wider view of these things. I'm necessarily drawing boundaries around my analysis, but if you want to take a wider view of these issues, I think your book is a good place to start. We in policy, we're trying to push and pull on the economy in certain ways, right? Push investment in certain directions. We can have some effect over how costs are allocated by passing laws that steer in things in particular directions. And yes, one of my big worries is the distribution of costs won't be fair. I don't think you see a lot of poor people at the table in climate policy discussions. Let me make that more concrete. If we talk about whether or not electricity prices in California are a problem, electricity rates in California are very high. They're more than twice what they are here in Texas, probably about 3 times what they are here in Texas. You can say that's a problem because electricity is expensive and poor Californians can't afford it. And the rejoinder you typically hear is that, well, the rates are high, but the bills are low because California is a mild state with a mild climate, and you don't need as much energy. And when you think about that rejoinder, you think about San Francisco and Los Angeles and the coast, right? But if you live in Bakersfield or Sacramento or Fresno, you have very hot summers and cold winters, and you have if you go look up the bill in each of those 2 places, they're very different for the same size residential building. So I think the distributional issues get swept under the rug because of the urgency with which people view the problem. And I hope we stop doing that.
Right. I did not pay you for that book plug. Book available at all fine internet sites that connect to the bookstores. So yeah, here we have another question from the chat. So to put my question in perspective, we have people on the progressive left, such as Ocasio-Cortez, and people on the denier side, say Harold Hamm, Continental Resources. If we cannot compromise, don't we risk a highly disruptive change once the chickens come home to roost? This suggests to me that some sort of sensible political compromise, coupled with perhaps some technological breakthrough, is inevitable unless we are willing to accept the risk of catastrophic consequences. So your thoughts on that comment, I guess compromise versus catastrophe, I'm not sure.
Well, I made reference to the time period, the only time period when the members of Congress were ideologically as far apart as they are now. And that period was before the Civil War. And you know how that disequilibrium was broken by war, right? So I don't mean to be melodramatic, but I think what we have now with the parties becoming more bitter, living in different realities. And I'm not suggesting that all realities are equally real, but in the minds of people, they live in different realities. And it's getting more sort of bitter and sporadically violent. I think that's not a sustainable, as the questioner suggests, not a sustainable path. But I don't necessarily see it with the sort of 24-hour devil on your shoulder in the form of the internet and 24-hour news telling you and encouraging you to think the worst about the other side. I don't see how we break that trend other than through something catastrophic. So the way we do is we have to have somebody stand up against those media outlets that are like, they're like a soap opera villain who's whispering in the ear of all the other characters trying to foment chaos. That's what they do all day long. And I think until that stops, I have a hard time tracing a path to a solution other than people sort of getting fed up with it and moving away from those sources of, and I'm putting my finger quotes out, news.
Thanks. Is just a follow on a instead of a physical civil war, I guess some might claim we're having a financial war of sorts due to debt accumulation of citizens. Do you hear anybody specifically talk about climate or energy transition and the concept of getting rid of debts? I mean, progressive economists talk about debt jubilees. Does anybody merge these ideas together in politics? Know of?
Yeah, well, certainly so there's been talk of Biden forgiving student debt, which apparently is within his power from federal debt agencies, and so and of course modern monetary theory, which is sort of the progressive is part of the progressive financial plan for sort of big government spending programs. So I think the Green New Deal estimate, we don't actually have a bill for the Green New Deal, but to the extent that an estimate exists, the number I've heard is 16.3 trillion. And most of that would be federal spending on the assumption that a lot more either debt or quantitative easing would not necessarily cause a problem for the American economy and the American financial system. And I have no idea whether that's true or not. But to me, it sounds as though that's a little bit outside of the sort of macroeconomic mainstream, even for liberal macroeconomists. But so yes, that's where I see that debt issue mentioned. Frankly, the parties seem selectively interested in debt when they're depending on whether they're in power, right? So I think now that we have a Democratic administration, there's going to be a lot more Republican interest in keeping the deficit low than there was beforehand.
Right. So, well, I'll save that for another time on the.
And it would be vice versa in another.
Yeah.
So I think that's true.
Yeah. MMT claimed that pretty much no one in Congress understands federal spending. And all right, so here we have another comment. So I'll just read it off so I get it well. It seems to me that periods of progress, certainly the New Deal era, were those with tremendous political contention. Progress on regulatory moves was not made through some sort of a Sam Rayburn type bipartisan bonhomie, but through large Democratic majorities bitterly opposed by Republicans. So seeking a mythical center, which may be an empty space in our polarized times, may lead only to very modest legislation. Instead, federal regulation may play a much bigger role, plus actions of states, cities, and social change induced through popular culture may have to do most of the work. So how can these be pushed with slim Democratic majorities? How can these other ideas, I guess, besides large federal legislation be pushed with slim Democratic majorities?
Yeah, and I should have mentioned that lots of I think I did mention, but only in one phrase, that lots of good things are happening in some states and in some municipalities and frankly, in the economy. I think we'll expect to see the economy itself, a lot more demand for clean energy coming from corporate buyers and things like that. I am less sanguine than some of my colleagues about the ability of the federal executive branch to do a lot under existing federal laws to rapidly transition to a net zero economy. And by rapidly, I mean in the next 30 years. I think the existing Clean Air Act is a very difficult lift for that right now, especially with a federal judiciary that's gotten more skeptical because of conservative appointees to the highest court and to the lower federal courts. So I posit this in this talk. I posit the objective of getting to net zero by mid-century. I think it's perfectly reasonable to be skeptical about finding a center, but I'm even more skeptical about massive Democratic dominance. And I'm skeptical about both. So I I guess I'm more optimistic than the questioner about the ability of individual Republicans, and you don't need a lot of them if the Congress is evenly divided, to eventually come around on these issues as their constituents experience more and more pain, climate pain.
Okay, so here's another one. Joe Biden has campaigned on ambitious climate goals as well as his desire to reach across the aisle. You see the areas where a Biden administration and a McConnell Senate could come to consensus on any climate issues. Could nuclear be an area where bipartisan support is at least theoretically possible? So maybe continuing off your comment there on just getting a few Republicans, but any ideas?
Yeah, I think you probably could get small bills that give a boost to particular technologies that McConnell or Republicans are okay with. So carbon capture and storage, which an area in which Texas has a comparative advantage for a number of reasons. Nuclear power might be another. People across the partisan and ideological spectrum like renewable energy. So subsidies for renewables seem to be more palatable to the GOP than emissions limits. And so although the tax credits for wind and solar have been allowed to sort of phase down over time, I wouldn't be beyond the realm of possibility that you could see another boost in those, although I'm not sure that would have a huge effect since they're already the cheapest forms of energy out there. So yeah, I could see little bills here and there. My personal pet preference is for a federal siting regime for transmission, which I think would unlock a tremendous amount of private investment in wind and solar across the country. That doesn't seem like a popular idea in Congress, except with a few members. But little bite-sized things could happen with the Republican Senate, but nothing. I don't think anything that significantly limits emissions or establishes a target of net zero could come
through. Right. Here's a question and then a comment, and I'll repeat the question at the end. Essentially about carbon pricing. Any comments on a recent significant efforts for establishing carbon pricing, and referring to FERC Chairman Chatterjee, who recently held an all-day technical conference exploring carbon pricing by FERC with a large variety of stakeholders. This person was observing and attending, observed it to be surprisingly supportive of the concept, including natural gas alliances, and it appeared to conclude that FERC could and probably should add a greenhouse gas emission pricing component. I'm not sure about which component of their domain. But of course, 3 days ago, President Trump removed Chatterjee from this chairmanship rather abruptly. And in a testament to Chatterjee's character, he says, seems unbowed and proud of discussing important and challenging issues. So a surprise from a former Mitch McConnell staff member, he quotes. So thoughts on this recent change and whether it has anything to do or tells us anything about carbon pricing possibilities.
Yeah, first of all, I agree with all that description of what happened. It was pretty surprising, and because the commission has to have two non-Republicans on it anyway, even under a Republican administration, the fact that Chatterjee is willing to consider carbon pricing in wholesale power markets is a really big deal because it creates a majority. It will create a majority for that idea. And it's also it's a symbolic step or a big step in the legal issue of whether or not the Federal Power Act authorizes that, right? There's been a debate about whether the Federal Power Act authorizes carbon pricing in its rate, sort of rate guidance. I think it does or could. I don't think should be a terribly controversial thing, but there are other people who think it doesn't. And so I think the question's a great question. The fact that he was moved out of the chairmanship, really won't change the fact that there's a majority for that if and when RTOs, the organizations that manage wholesale power markets, if and when they come to the FERC, sort of seeking the permission to add a carbon adder to their wholesale market prices, spot prices, there'll be 3 out of 5 votes in favor of saying yes. And so I think it's a big deal. And I'm just as surprised as the questioner is about where it came from. And in terms of whether that bodes well for carbon taxes, yes, I think if I think it's really a hard sell for the Democrats to have carbon taxes that then are paired with some sort of limits on the ability to regulate emissions under the Clean Air Act. And that's how it's been proposed so far from the right. And I don't see that commanding a majority. I think it'd be hard for Democrats to say yes to that.
Right, excellent. So yeah, maybe there's still a chance for a few strategically placed people to make a large impact.
Yeah.
I'll go 2 questions here roughly together because they're both about translating to a global perspective versus, say, just the United States. First comment, your point about the costs in California of electricity, say, costs in California versus Texas is a microcosm of issues worldwide for decarbonization. California solutions maybe just too expensive to be applied to the poorest. This is 2 billion, could be 4 billion on the planet. So how do we pay attention to global issues? Similar question. A lot of climate mitigation requires global participation. So how does this affect the equations about, I don't know, I guess about what the US can do or should do? And then maybe you could step out of the US perspective as much as you like.
I neglected to say when I was talking about the California example that California does a much better job than we do here in Texas of providing support for poor people to pay their power bills. So it may be very expensive in Bakersfield, but if you're below the poverty line, you get a lot of help paying your power bill. Not that you don't get some people don't get some help here, but I think California is one of the states that does pretty well helping people deal with energy costs. And I would give a shout out to the Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute here in Austin that does a lot of good work on those kinds of issues. In terms of so the international, the sort of fact that this is a global problem requiring a global solution is true. I think I said earlier that I don't think that necessarily, that the fact that India and China are growing and have not yet committed, at least in a credible way, to reducing emissions ought not to stop the United States or Europe from acting. And I think that's in part because we grew to wealth. This is really an ethical argument. We grew to wealth by exploiting these resources and creating the emissions that are causing the bulk of the problem, that is the United States and Europe. And that to me imposes a duty on us to act. And I think if we do act for the reasons I explained earlier, I think that will make it easier for developing countries, especially the big two, India and China, to act as well, because I think it'll be cheaper to do so as the developed world sort of forces this process along, which will yield technological advancements and cost reductions that will make it easier for everybody else. So I'm not naive about the ability to sort of come together and have one big agreement. I don't think that's likely, but I think getting action on the part of India and China is more likely after the United States has taken action than it is without US action.
Right. I'll follow on to your comment there and go to the last question. Do you have any, I guess, information or know of studies or organizations, or do you know any numbers off the top of your head about the California, say, energy costs adjustments for low incomes? Is it, how substantial it is, 50% of the bill? Or?
I don't have a good number there. I know that there are, so there's a federal program, and then the federal program is woefully underfunded. I'm getting this information, by the way, from the organization I just mentioned, and TEPRI, but there's a federal program that can only fund a very small percentage of the people that actually qualify. And then so you need state programs to supplement. And every state has some assistance. But my understanding is that California does a particularly good job, as does Massachusetts and New York and a few other states with energy costs. I don't have numbers for you though.
Right, yeah, just curious. I guess it's one of these examples, like the question earlier on, are we in control of distribution more than size? And in this case, you can choose to distribute to low incomes if you can make that choice. So, all right, so we'll end with this question here, last one. This is outside of the details of policy, but more on your filter bubble kind of comments. Let me pause just for a second for the phone to stop ringing. Okay, so what advice do you have for navigating the news or media sphere in an efficient manner and avoiding propaganda and emotionally charged arguments? It's getting harder and harder to decipher truth in the news, which is frustrating to decipher with only so much free time in the day. So we can, I don't know, your thoughts on that, either within the energy sphere or climate sphere or anything, I guess.
So I guess the main things that I try to do is I make sure well, there's sort of general news and then there's energy news, right? So in the general news, I've shifted my intake to longer form sources. I don't watch any TV news anymore. Even the papers, you know, I'm doing more sort of Atlantic and Economist, right? There's a sort of the Atlantic and the Economist. You get these long form treatments of issues, and then I go to the AP app for my daily news, right? So that I try to be balanced and to make sure I read to the 20th paragraph, you know, or that there is a 20th paragraph, right? So, and then the other thing I try to do is, and I do something similar with energy news, but the thing I try to do is, I think it just takes sort of, it's almost like physical exercise. You have to remind yourself every day to think critically, to ask the hard questions about the stories that please you the most, right? So if you get a news item about a study that sort of supports your view of things and makes you happy, that's the time to sort of activate those critical thinking muscles and, you know, say, wait a minute, what are the limits of this? To whom does it apply? Who does it not apply to? And what were the assumptions they made? I know that takes time, and you're going to miss out on some other things as a result of that. But I do think that the process of sort of learning to sort of really despise one another or despise the other side and to believe and not believe anything they say gets in the way of finding the kind of solutions that are the actual real solutions, right? These biases, the only people that really avoid these biases well are the people that have to make high stakes decisions based on this information. The Department of Defense never fell for climate denial, even when the executive branch was run by people who were discrediting climate science. During the George W. Bush administration, the Defense Department planning was all around climate change and how their mission would change as the climate changed. They never fell for sort of the official line that was coming out of the EPA head at the time, the second EPA head under Bush. So people that make high stakes decisions where their job is on the line or where human lives are on the line, they tend to find a way to find out the truth and to avoid these biases or at least guard against them. We don't have that pressure on us, so we have to work hard to do it ourselves and just sort of, it's like getting up and doing and running or swimming or whatever it is you do. It's like forcing yourself to do that, but mentally. It's not a satisfying answer, I know.
It's a hard question to answer. So yeah. Your answer for sure. So we'll end there. So again, thank you very much, Dr. David Spence, who is our Baker Botts Chair in Law at the University of Texas Law School and Professor of Business, Government, and Society in the McCombs